A flight attendant humiliated a quiet African man in front of the entire cabin, told him he didn't belong in business class. What she didn't know, he was the president of Burkina Faso. No security, no spotlight, just silent power. What happened next went viral and left the world speechless. This is the story you need to hear. It started with a voice, cold, dismissive, and loud enough to draw the attention of half the cabin. "Excuse me, sir, you're in the wrong seat," the flight attendant snapped, her tone sharp like a blade slicing through calm air. Heads turned. The man she was speaking to looked up, startled by the sudden confrontation, but showing no sign of anger. He was an African man, probably in his 30s, seated quietly near the front of the business class section. He didn't look threatening. In fact, he looked remarkably ordinary. No tailored suit, no gold watch, no obvious security detail nearby. He wore a plain black jacket, jeans, and simple sneakers. Next to him on the floor was a worn leather bag, the kind you'd expect from a frequent traveler. He had no laptop out, no champagne glass in hand, just a book in his lap and the window to his right. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed as she looked at him. In her mind, something didn't fit. "This seat is for business class passengers only," she said again, louder this time, so others could hear. "You must have taken the wrong turn after boarding. Economy is at the back of the plane, sir." The man looked at her, calmly, silently, not in defiance, but as if he were waiting for her to realize the mistake she was making. Passengers around him began to notice. Some pretended not to. Others looked awkward, unsure of how to react. The cabin, moments earlier filled with the quiet hum of settling in, grew tense. Without saying a word, the man slowly reached into his jacket pocket. His movements were deliberate, respectful, perhaps to avoid making the situation worse. He pulled out a folded boarding pass and held it up for her to see. She snatched it quickly, scanning it with an impatient glance. Her eyebrows twitched. The name was clearly printed. The seat was correct. The class was marked business. Still, she hesitated. There was no apology, no softening of tone, just a quiet click of her tongue. "Humph," she muttered, before handing the pass back with a tight, forced smile. "Fine." And just like that, she walked away. No "I'm sorry." No acknowledgement that she had made a mistake. No hint of shame or even courtesy. It was as if she still didn't believe it. As if this man, this black man with no visible signs of wealth, couldn't possibly belong there. Not in this seat. Not in this class. Not on this level. The man sighed softly, folded the boarding pass, and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he turned back to the window, as if none of it had happened. But it had, and others had seen it. About 2 rows ahead, a middle-aged journalist, himself African, had been watching the entire exchange from his seat. He recognized the quiet passenger almost immediately, though he hadn't expected to see him on a commercial flight, let alone dressed so modestly and alone. The man in the seat was Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, a former army captain who had risen to power in 2022 after leading a bold coup. Traoré was not just a politician. He had become a symbol, a figure representing African independence, youth leadership, and resistance to foreign control. He was admired, especially across the continent, for his straightforward speech, his refusal to live luxuriously, and his commitment to walk among the people. But here he was, mistaken for an economy-class passenger, questioned publicly, and dismissed like an inconvenience. The journalist was stunned, not just at the flight attendant's arrogance, but at the president's calm. In that moment, he realized something powerful. True leadership doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need to boast or prove itself. It simply exists. After a few moments, the journalist stood up quietly, walked back, and bent slightly at Traoré's seat. "Mr. President," he said respectfully in French, "it's an honor to see you, sir. I witnessed what happened, and I want to apologize on behalf of those who don't recognize who you are." Traoré smiled, not the forced kind, but one of warmth and understanding. "There is no need to apologize," he said softly. "People often judge too quickly, but that's their burden, not mine." The journalist nodded, deeply moved. With permission, he took a discreet photo, not a posed image, but a candid one, Traore looking out the window, with the glow of the clouds reflected softly on the glass. That photo would travel far, but at the time, it was just a quiet moment between two men who understood what had just taken place. An accidental lesson in humility, perception, and dignity. The boarding pass was real. The seat was correct. Every detail was in order. Yet the attitude didn't shift. Instead of an apology, or even a polite nod, the flight attendant offered a barely noticeable shrug, followed by a half-hearted "Okay then," as she turned on her heel and walked away. No smile. No effort to make the man feel welcome. Not even the most basic courtesy you'd extend to any paying passenger. To her, he was still just some African man, a fluke in the business class cabin. In her mind, maybe someone else had paid for his seat. Maybe he was a last-minute upgrade. Or maybe, just maybe, he had found his way there by mistake and got lucky. Whatever the case, she was clearly annoyed that he was sitting in a seat that didn't seem to match his appearance. But what she didn't know, and didn't bother to ask, was this. The man she had just dismissed with cold indifference wasn't a tourist, nor a businessman on a short trip. He wasn't someone who got lucky, or happened to be upgraded. That man was Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, and the youngest sitting head of state in Africa. As the plane soared quietly above the clouds, cruising toward its destination, the earlier moment of tension seemed to dissolve into the gentle hum of the engines. Passengers had returned to their routines, adjusting seatbelts, flipping through in-flight magazines, or scrolling through their devices. To most, the incident between the flight attendant and the African passenger was already forgotten. But not for everyone. A few rows ahead, seated comfortably in first class, a man sat unusually still, eyes glancing subtly over his shoulder every few moments. He had been watching, not out of curiosity, but with a growing sense of disbelief. His name was Eric Doumbia, a respected journalist from Côte d'Ivoire. He had just wrapped up a week-long global media conference in Brussels, where African voices were finally being given space to talk about representation, development, and dignity. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had flown across continents discussing colonial legacies and the dangers of stereotyping, only to witness it firsthand at 30,000 feet. And it wasn't just any victim of disrespect. Eric had recognized the man the moment he stepped on board, even in civilian clothes, without fanfare. The soft-spoken passenger who had just been mistaken for an economy traveler was President Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest head of state on the continent, and the very embodiment of the topics Eric had been debating all week. Hours after the flight touched down and passengers went their separate ways, a quiet storm was already brewing online, one that would grow into a global conversation. The moment had passed in the air, but not in the mind of the journalist, Eric Doumbia. Still moved by what he had witnessed, and deeply inspired by President Ibrahim Traoré's quiet strength, he opened his phone, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure whether to share what he had seen. But then he remembered the look on the flight attendant's face, the arrogance, the assumption, the complete absence of remorse, and he thought of the millions who had faced the same kind of subtle prejudice, not for what they did, but for how they looked. So he typed, "Today, I witnessed a flight attendant dismiss and embarrass one of the most important leaders in Africa, simply because he looked too ordinary to be flying business class." That man was President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. He attached the photo, that calm, striking image of Traoré by the window, unaware he was about to become a symbol. He hit post. What happened next was something even he didn't expect. Within minutes, the tweet began to gain traction. Within hours, it had gone viral. Thousands of retweets, then tens of thousands. People from all across Africa, the diaspora, and beyond began to share their thoughts, not just about the incident, but about the deeper issues it exposed. The hashtags #RespectAllPassengers, #IbrahimTraore, and #DoNotJudgeByAppearance began to trend globally. One user wrote, "This is exactly why many African leaders surround themselves with pomp and security, because if they don't, they get disrespected. Salute to Traoré for staying grounded." Another tweeted, "If this happened to a president, imagine what ordinary Africans go through every day." And then came the flood of stories, hundreds, even thousands of replies from people sharing similar experiences. A Ghanaian businesswoman turned away from first class because staff assumed she couldn't afford it. A Kenyan doctor told to wait in the economy line while holding a business class boarding pass. A Nigerian professor asked if he was carrying someone else's passport. The tweet had tapped into something far bigger than one moment. It had struck at the heart of unconscious bias and how it plays out in everyday life. Major African media outlets picked it up first, then international ones followed. Headlines blazed across timelines. President of Burkina Faso mistaken for economy passenger on international flight. Humble leader, big message. Ibrahim Traoré's silent response sparks global debate. From disrespect to viral moment, the power of grace in the face of bias. Even outlets like BBC, Al Jazeera, and CNN Africa covered the story. Talk shows discussed it. Panelists debated it. Influencers dissected it in emotional video reactions. YouTubers and TikTok creators posted commentary. The clip of the tweet, combined with footage of Traore speaking passionately about African unity in a past speech, was remixed into powerful montages that racked up millions of views. But what resonated with everyone, across race, nationality, and class, was the dignity of the president. He hadn't argued. He hadn't revealed his identity to gain respect. He hadn't made a scene. Instead, he let his silence speak, and the world listened. President Ibrahim Traoré never released an official statement about what happened on that flight. No tweet, no press conference, no angry demand for an apology. He didn't name the airline. He didn't scold the flight attendant. He didn't even acknowledge the global outrage that followed. He stayed silent, and in that silence, the world listened. Weeks later, during a national interview back home in Burkina Faso, a journalist finally asked him about the incident. It was a question many had waited for. The cameras rolled, the audience leaned in, and social media buzzed with anticipation. Traoré gave a small, knowing smile before answering. Leadership is not about demanding respect. It's about earning it and knowing who you are, even when others don't. No bitterness, no drama, just truth. That quote would go on to echo far beyond the studio. It was shared across platforms in dozens of languages. Teachers pinned it to bulletin boards. Motivational speakers opened seminars with it. Parents wrote it in their children's journals. Young Africans made it their phone wallpaper. It became more than a sentence. It became a life lesson. In a world obsessed with image, with loud voices, flashy titles, and constant self-promotion, President Ibrahim Traoré had delivered a masterclass in silent strength. He had reminded the world of something powerful. Real power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to wear a suit or sit in a palace. Real power walks quietly, carries itself with dignity, and speaks only when it has something to say. And when it does speak, the world listens. The incident on that flight became more than a viral story. It became a cultural moment, a mirror held up to society, asking uncomfortable but necessary questions. How often do we judge people based on appearance? Why do we associate value with clothing, accent, or skin tone? How many leaders, thinkers, or heroes do we overlook every day simply because they don't look the part? Across the global South, particularly in Africa, the story ignited conversations about representation, humility, and the often invisible burdens carried by Black leaders in international spaces. Many compared Traoré's grace to other iconic figures, Nelson Mandela, who forgave those who imprisoned him, or Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary former president, who lived modestly and rejected luxury. Traoré wasn't trying to be a hero. He was simply being himself. But that, it turns out, was enough to inspire millions. And what about the flight attendant? According to sources close to the airline, she was suspended after the incident went public. The company required her to undergo mandatory cultural sensitivity and diversity training. Internally, the airline admitted the need for serious reform in how staff are trained to interact with passengers from diverse backgrounds. There were rumors, quiet whispers, that she later reached out with a handwritten letter of apology addressed directly to President Traoré. Some say she had no idea who he was and felt terrible once she learned the truth. Others believe she genuinely wanted to make things right, not because of the backlash, but because of the way he had responded, with quiet dignity. Whether Traoré ever replied to that letter, no one knows. But in typical Traore fashion, if he did respond, it was probably not with anger, but with the same grace that turned a moment of insult into a global lesson in leadership. The world didn't just remember the disrespect, it remembered the reaction, the silence, the stillness, the quote, and most of all, the message. Never judge a person by how they look or how quietly they sit, because you never know who you're sitting next to. That simple truth has never felt more relevant. On that flight, there were no grand speeches, no confrontations, no dramatic reveals, just a quiet man in a business class seat, looking out a window, misunderstood, misjudged, but completely at peace with who he was. And sometimes, that's the strongest kind of leadership there is, because true leaders don't need spotlights. They lead with presence, not performance. They teach through action, not reaction. And they remind us that the most powerful people are often the ones who don't need to remind you at all. Final thoughts, narrator voiceover option in this world. We cross paths with hundreds, even thousands of people in our lives, at airports, in offices, on the street. And too often we judge. Quickly, harshly, based on clothes, skin, posture, accent. But Ibrahim Traoré's story teaches us this. Dignity isn't worn, it's lived. Respect shouldn't be earned by appearance. It should be given by default. So the next time you see someone who seems ordinary, pause, smile, because they just might be carrying greatness inside them. And the most extraordinary people, they're not always in the spotlight. Sometimes, they're sitting quietly, right next to you. Meanwhile, the airline, now facing a rapidly growing PR crisis, had no choice but to respond. Within 24 hours, they released a public statement. We are aware of the incident involving one of our cabin crew and a passenger identified as President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. We take matters of dignity and customer experience very seriously. An internal investigation is underway, and we apologize unreservedly for any disrespect shown. But the statement didn't land well. People accused it of being too vague, too corporate, too late. Many demanded that the flight attendant be held accountable, not as a scapegoat, but as an example of what unchecked assumptions can lead to. Protests broke out online, not with anger, but with creativity. People changed their profile pictures to the viral image of Traoré. Artists painted portraits of him seated on that plane. Poets penned verses about the man who didn't need to speak to be heard. The Burkinabe people, proud of their leader, rallied behind him with admiration. In Ouagadougou, a mural of the viral photo was painted on a wall near the university. The quote he had said during the flight, "People judge quickly based on color, clothes, or class," became a slogan for African dignity. But Traoré himself? As always, he remained silent. No official comment, no televised address, no social media post from his account. His silence wasn't weakness. It was power, the power of knowing who you are, even when others don't. And that's what truly shook people. Because in a world where so many scrambled to go viral, to prove themselves, or to retaliate when wronged, President Ibrahim Traoré had done none of that, and still became a symbol of grace and quiet resistance. He didn't need headlines. He didn't need applause. He just needed a moment, one that revealed not only the depth of bias, but the power of humility. The story became more than a trending topic. It became a mirror, forcing the world to look at itself, at how we treat others based on how they look, what they wear, or where they're from. And through it all, one message echoed louder than any viral tweet. Respect is not something you earn by looking important. It's something you give, without knowing who someone is, because every person deserves it. Eric couldn't believe it. He had covered Traoré's rise to leadership from the beginning, a young, disciplined soldier who had captured the heart of a nation tired of exploitation and false promises. Traoré wasn't just another name in politics. He was a movement, a rare blend of courage, humility, and quiet strength. The president's stance against foreign interference and his bold, unapologetic love for Africa had made him both admired and controversial on the world stage. While many bowed to global powers, Traoré spoke like a lion, but walked like a monk. And now he was here, treated like a nobody by someone too blind to look past the surface. Eric felt a knot tighten in his chest. Should he say something? Would it be intrusive? He debated with himself, watching as the president stared calmly out the window, unmoved by the earlier insult. But Eric knew silence wouldn't sit right with him. He stood up, took a deep breath, and slowly walked down the aisle. As he approached, he softened his voice, not wanting to draw attention. He bowed slightly in a gesture of respect, not out of formality, but from genuine admiration. "Mr. President," he said quietly in French, "it's truly an honor to see you here. I witnessed what happened earlier, and I want to sincerely apologize for what you experienced." The president turned his head, surprised but not offended. He recognized the man vaguely, from news coverage and panel discussions. There was a brief pause, and then a gentle smile. "There's no need for apologies, my brother," Traore replied. His voice was soft, yet carried a certain weight, the kind of voice shaped by battlefield decisions and sleepless nights thinking about the future of a nation. That's the world we live in. People judge quickly, based on color, clothes, or class. But that doesn't define us. Eric was moved. This was the same man who had challenged global powers on live television, the same leader who had walked through villages without bodyguards. And here he was, still humble, still gracious, despite the insult. They spoke for a few minutes, quietly, about Africa's future, about the burden of leadership, and the loneliness that often came with choosing a path different from the norm. "Do you mind if I take a photo?" Eric asked. Not for fame, not to create a scene, just to remember this moment. Traore gave a small nod. Eric raised his phone, carefully avoiding drawing attention, and snapped a subtle picture. The president was seated peacefully, framed by the soft light coming through the plane window. His gaze was distant, reflective, a man deep in thought, carrying the weight of a nation, yet somehow at ease with the storm around him. Eric didn't post the photo right away. He thought about it, long and hard. But later, once the flight had landed and the moment had passed, he decided to share it, not as a gossip piece, but as a lesson. The tweet was simple. "Today, I witnessed a flight attendant disrespect one of the most dignified men I've ever known, because he didn't look like a VIP. That man was President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Leadership isn't in the suit you wear. It's in how you carry your silence." The tweet exploded. Within hours, it had been retweeted tens of thousands of times. African youth, international allies, activists, and everyday people from around the world resonated with the story. Hashtags trended. Hashtag Ibrahim Traoré. Hashtag respect all passengers. Hashtag power in silence. People shared their own experiences of being misjudged, overlooked, and stereotyped. Back in Burkina Faso, the photo was printed in newspapers, aired on local TV, and pinned to the walls of classrooms. It was more than just an image. It was a symbol that no matter how high you rise, you can still be brought low by ignorance, and that your reaction, your grace under pressure, is what defines your character. As for the flight attendant, she would eventually be named in an internal review. The airline, under public pressure, issued an apology. She was reportedly required to undergo racial sensitivity and cultural awareness training. Some said she later wrote a private letter of apology. Whether President Traoré ever responded remains a mystery. But one thing was certain. That moment on the plane wasn't just another act of subtle prejudice. It became a global reminder that true power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears jeans, carries a book, and quietly watches the sky. Born in 1988, Ibrahim Traoré didn't come from luxury, nor did he inherit power. He had been raised in modest conditions in the dusty heartlands of Burkina Faso. As a young man, he chose a path of service, enrolling in the military and dedicating his life to protecting his nation. Quiet, intelligent, strategic, Traoré quickly rose through the ranks, not by privilege, but through merit. By the time he was in his mid-30s, the political landscape in his country was in turmoil. Corruption ran deep, external influence was strong, and the people had grown tired of leaders who talked but didn't act. Then, in 2022, the country witnessed a dramatic shift. Traoré, then a captain in the army, led a coup that ousted the previous leader. But unlike many military takeovers that are driven by personal ambition, it's had a different tone, one of nationalism, sovereignty, and protection. Traore didn't declare himself a king. He didn't sit on a golden throne or build statues in his name. Instead, he promised to return power to the people and fight the exploitation of Burkina Faso's natural resources by foreign powers. He spoke openly against neocolonialism, Western control, and the puppeteering of African politics by outside forces. His message was clear. Africa must stand on its own feet, with dignity and unity. Yet despite the power he held, he remained a man of the people. He chose not to surround himself with security guards and sunglasses. He didn't move around in expensive motorcades when unnecessary. And he certainly didn't flaunt his title or demand VIP treatment at every turn. On this flight, he had chosen to travel light, dressed plainly, and without making a fuss. That decision, though noble, had led to the moment of subtle humiliation, a moment that revealed how deeply appearances influence perception. To the flight attendant, a man like him simply didn't look the part. His skin, his clothes, his silence, they didn't fit the image she had in her mind of who belonged in business class. She never thought to ask his name. She never looked closely at the boarding pass after confirming the seat. She didn't pause to consider that maybe, just maybe, this man was far more than he appeared. And that's exactly how President Ibrahim Traoré wanted it. He wasn't just a leader by title. He was a symbol. To many young Africans, he represented something they hadn't seen in decades. A head of state who wasn't trying to please foreign governments or line his pockets, but one who spoke about real change, who challenged the status quo and wasn't afraid to call out injustice, even when it came from global superpowers. He didn't seek validation from the world. His confidence didn't come from red carpets, press conferences, or designer suits. It came from knowing who he was and what he stood for. And in that moment, seated by the window of a commercial aircraft, looking out at the clouds rolling across the horizon, he was as calm and steady as ever. He had seen worse, much worse. The sting of racism, the shadow of imperialism, the scars of war. These were not new to him. A cold glance or a rude comment was barely a scratch. But what it did reveal was a deeper truth. Respect is often withheld based on assumptions. And those assumptions are too often tied to color, accent, or wardrobe. What many didn't realize was that the very strength of a leader like Traore was in his humility. He didn't need grand speeches to prove his power. He didn't need a uniform or medals to command presence. He understood something far more important. The most powerful people are often the ones who don't need to remind you who they are. Later, when asked about incidents like this, Traore would simply smile and say, "I prefer it this way." When they underestimate you, they reveal who they are, not who you are. That moment, that quiet confrontation at 30,000 feet, wasn't just about a boarding pass or a seat number. It was about perception, prejudice, and the silent dignity of a man who could have demanded respect, but chose to earn it quietly. And while the flight attendant walked away, oblivious to what had just occurred, the rest of the world would soon learn about it. And many would be reminded of an old, powerful truth. Never judge a person by what they wear, how they speak, or the color of their skin. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one with the loudest legacy. The rest of the flight passed without incident. But what the flight attendant had failed to see in those few moments would soon ripple far beyond the cabin. Because sometimes, the person you dismiss as nobody is carrying more history, power, and grace than you could ever imagine. And in a world obsessed with appearances, it's those who don't demand respect who often deserve it the most. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you something to think about, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, true stories from around the world. Tap the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember, sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest truths. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.